Listen, man, I love looking into old stuff, especially about the Titanic. Let's check this video out.
The RMS Titanic was branded by many at the time to be an unsinkable ship. However, if you look at history and conspiracies, it seems like the RMS Titanic was sewn together by bad omen and crucial mistakes from beginning to end. From forebodings of a tragedy to the ship's missing key, here are 20 mysterious photos before the Titanic sank. Number 20. The ship's good luck charm. This is a photo of Jenny, the cat aboard the Titanic. Yes, aside from the passengers who boarded the Titanic, there were animals. Or rather, just pet dogs, really, and I'll get to them later. Jenny was among the animal passengers of the Titanic, but she wasn't with the guests. She was a ship cat, a common feature on ships at the time, meant to control the rat population. Jenny was seen as a good luck charm, as were most ship cats. After all, they kept the pests away, and they were cute to look at as they roamed around the ship with no restrictions, gallivanting as if they owned the watercraft. There was no new...
Everything I've watched or read, I've never heard them talk about animals. That's crazy to hear that now all of a sudden.
News as to whether Jenny sank with the Titanic. While many believe she perished along with the other human victims of the tragedy, others believe that Jenny predicted Titanic's tragedy. It's quite interesting. She's thought to have come aboard the Titanic while it was docked in Belfast, making her home in the galley. In early April 1912, shortly before the Titanic set off on its doomed voyage, Jenny had kittens. She and her young were cared for by Joseph Mulholland, an Irish stoker. Now, legend has it that Jenny took her kittens off the ship one by one when the Titanic docked at Southampton. Mulholland, seeing the cat choose to relocate her young, decided to let the Titanic leave without him. He claimed that Jenny must have seen the disaster. Perhaps her motherly instinct saved her and her litter. Well, at least this is what legends claim. To this day, the true story of Jenny remains shrouded in mystery. Before we go...
I mean, come on, that's a bit of a stretch now. Maybe that was just her stop and her kids needed to get off and that's where she wanted to get off at. Thanks for the ride. What do you mean? That was a sign. Like, I'm all about animals being able to see things before it happened. Absolutely. Pay attention to the animals. But this one, that's a little stretch.
Go on. Like this video, smash the subscribe button, and click the notification bell right now.
Number 19. Lifeboats on board. Did you know that even before the Titanic sank, many noticed the number of lifeboats wasn't enough? When the Titanic commenced its doomed first voyage in April 1912, it was outfitted with only 20 lifeboats, a figure dramatically insufficient for the number of passengers and crew on board. Perhaps it was the ignorance of this protocol that sealed the Titanic's fate. The Titanic was equipped with a mix of lifeboats, 14 standard wooden lifeboats, each with a 65-person capacity, 2 wooden cutters accommodating 40 people each, and 4 collapsible canvas lifeboats, capable of holding 47 individuals apiece. Altogether, these boats had a capacity for about 1,178 people, just a fraction of the ship's full capacity. However, even this limited capacity wasn't fully utilized, as lifeboats were launched with significantly fewer passengers than they could hold. The Titanic's fate was doomed from the beginning to the end. Initially, the ship was designed to carry 32 lifeboats, which would have sufficed for people on board, given that all spaces were properly occupied. Yet, this number was cut to 20 to prevent overcrowding of the decks. This decision was in line with the then current regulations, which based lifeboat requirements on the ship's cargo, not on its passenger capacity. The deployment of the lifeboats was a complicated and drawn-out operation. It required 80 minutes to send off all 16 lifeboats, averaging about 10 minutes per boat. The first boat launched with only 28 people, despite having room for 65, as many passengers initially underestimated the severity of their predicament and hesitated to vacate the ship. And to make matters worse, all of the lifeboat drills were canceled. Number 18.
Yeah, that was just a product of them being overconfident in an unsinkable ship. They deemed themselves an unsinkable ship, so that was them being overconfident.
Mummy's Curse. This eerie-looking mummy is known as the Unlucky Mummy. There have been claims that it caused the RMS Titanic to sink. This artifact is not an actual mummy, but rather a painted wooden mummy board or inner coffin lid from the late 21st or early 22nd dynasty. It was discovered in Thebes and is now in the British Museum, catalogued as EA22542. The story goes that the mummy board depicts a high-ranking woman involved in temple music rituals. It was among the cargo on the Titanic on its maiden and last voyage. Number 17. David Blair and the missing binoculars. The lack of binoculars for the ship's lookouts is often cited as a contributing factor to the disaster. Reports suggest that the binoculars were unavailable because David Blair, initially appointed as the second officer on the Titanic, was reassigned to another vessel just days before the Titanic's departure. In the haste of his departure, Blair mistakenly took the key to the crow's nest locker, where the binoculars were supposedly kept. This allegedly turned out to be a fatal mistake. This reshuffle of officers, which saw Blair's reassignment on April 9, 1912, led to the demotion of William Murdoch and Charles Lightoller, and Blair's complete removal from the ship's command. For this reason, the binoculars intended for use in the crow's nest lookout remained inaccessible throughout the voyage. There are, however, variations to the story. Some claim the locker was found to be open but empty, while others suggest Blair might have left the binoculars in his cabin or taken them as they were his personal property. Regardless, the binoculars were nowhere to be found. The absence of the binoculars became a point of discussion in the post-sinking investigations. This has fueled speculation about whether the availability of binoculars might have changed the voyage's tragic end. Number 16.
See, it's just a long list of things that point to why this ship should have never been on the water in the first place. It didn't have an adequate number of lifeboats. The binoculars needed to see out into the water, into the distance, to be able to alert people of, or alert the ship's captain and all of them of things that could be potential hazards or dangers. Another reason, and I guarantee you the passengers knew none of this stuff. Nothing.
Near collision in Southampton. This ship isn't the RMS Titanic, but rather the New York. This might have been one of the factors that slowly pushed Titanic closer to its doomed fate. On the morning of April 10, 1912, as the RMS Titanic was departing Southampton for its maiden voyage, the Titanic's enormous size and the force of its propellers caused an unexpected and dangerous situation. RMS Titanic was running at 6 knots when she passed by the New York and the Oceanic, who were tied together. The SS New York was accidentally dislodged from its berth by the water displacement created by the Titanic's movement. As a result, the New York began to drift toward the Titanic, presenting a real risk of collision. Quick action by Captain Smith, assisted by pilot George Boyer and the tugboat Vulcan, successfully averted what could have been a disastrous start to the Titanic's journey. This incident, which delayed the Titanic's departure, was seen by some as an unsettling sign of what was to come. Number 15. The Dogs of Titanic. It's an excellent feeling for pet owners to experience adventures with their beloved furry friends. However, the first class who brought their dogs with them on the Titanic only realized their mistakes in the end. When the Titanic embarked on April 10, 1912, it had 12 dogs aboard, all belonging to first-class passengers. This diverse group included breeds like an Airedale named Kitty, whom we're 100% sure was a dog despite its name, a Pekingese named Sun Yat-sen, and a Pomeranian named Lady, along with other purebreds and cherished pets of some of the ship's wealthiest passengers. It wasn't cheap to secure a place on the Titanic, especially for pets. The lives of these dogs on the Titanic mirrored the luxury experienced by their affluent owners. The smaller breeds were pampered in the first-class cabins, while the larger breeds were comfortably accommodated in well-appointed kennels on F-deck. They were regularly taken for walks on the poop deck. Quick fun fact, the poop deck is actually a short, high deck of the ship, and it has nothing to do with actual poop. It was named after the French term la poupe, which means the stern. The dogs of the Titanic were often brought into this section of the ship by the bellhops. There was even an informal dog show planned for April 15, a poignant event that would never happen due to the ship's sinking. During the catastrophe, only 3 canine passengers, all smaller breeds, managed to survive. Fortunate survivors included 2 Pomeranians and the Pekingese Sun Yat-sen, their diminutive size enabling the owners to bring them onto the lifeboats inconspicuously. Sadly, the larger dogs did not make it through the disaster. Number 14.
I was sitting here wondering, that was a question that was going through my mind. Did any animal survive? Because in everything we've watched, I've only seen them really focus on the people, never really the animals. Like I said before, I didn't even know they had animals aboard the ship. But to hear that at least something or some of them, 3, according to this video, survived because they had to sneak them, probably in a jacket or something, onto the lifeboat.
J.P. Morgan's Cancellation. J.P. Morgan is among the most prominent people who canceled their tickets and didn't show up on the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic. However, his last-minute cancellation led to some dark theories. Morgan, a prominent financier and the owner of the International Mercantile Marine Company, which owned the White Star Line and the Titanic, was initially scheduled to be on the ship. Yet just before the Titanic set sail, he unexpectedly called off his trip. Various explanations for this change of plans have been suggested, including health issues and a desire to continue his stay in France, possibly for a relaxing time at a spa with his mistress. While it wasn't seen as something suspicious until the Titanic sank, J.P. Morgan was a prominent figure, and it would be expected for him to want to socialize with others on the ship. And so, many believe that he might have known about the RMS Titanic's fate. Many believe he planned the ship's sinking to eliminate business rivals against his financial plans, particularly the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Advocates of this view contend that removing these key individuals on the Titanic would facilitate the establishment of the Federal Reserve. Another more speculative theory with even less substantiation links Morgan to the 1898 novel Futility by Morgan Robertson, which eerily foretold a disaster involving an unsinkable ship akin to the Titanic. Some conspiracy theorists speculate whether this novel influenced Morgan to orchestrate a similar catastrophe. While it's true that these theories are merely, well, theories, many continue to dwell on their probability. Number 13. The ship who watched the Titanic sink. This ship is the SS Californian, a steamship of the British Leyland Line. On the night the Titanic sank, this ship was in close proximity to the Titanic. And yet, despite its proximity and the distress signals raised by the Titanic, the Californian took no action. But here's what's not often discussed. You see, hours before the Titanic struck the iceberg, the Californian's radio operator sent a message warning nearby ships, including the Titanic, of ice fields ahead. This warning, however, did not reach the Titanic's captain because the radio operator, Jack Phillips, did not deem it urgent enough to interrupt his communications. Another fatal mistake.
Another issue. So, the binoculars, lifeboats, and now we're not even going to pay attention to the radio signals that are coming in, alerting us of the icebergs that are ahead, or as they termed it, ice fields. Ice field sounds really, really crazy to me, by the way. That just lets me know how many there were. There were a ton of them out there. So, why are we even on this boat if y'all not going to do any of the things right that we need to?
At the time, Phillips was busy transmitting passenger messages, and the Californian's warning did not begin with the MSG, or Master Servicegram prefix, which would have made it a message that required a mandatory acknowledgement from the Titanic's captain. And yet, even after the Titanic hit the iceberg and began to sink, there was a critical window during which the Californian could have potentially played a significant role in the rescue efforts. The Californian's crew did see the Titanic's distress rockets, and a carpenter on board, James McGregor, even claimed to have seen both the ship and the rockets. However, the California's radio operator had gone off duty by this time, and Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian did not take action to assist the Titanic. Inquiries following the disaster concluded that the Californian could have saved many, if not all, of the lives lost on the Titanic if it had responded to the distress signals. Captain Lord faced significant criticism for his inaction, although formal charges were never brought against him or his crew. Despite this, Captain Lord spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name. The Californian itself met a tragic end 3 years after the Titanic tragedy, as it was sunk by a German submarine during World War I. Touché. Number 12.
Hearing this makes me think, and I start to think after hearing all of this stuff, and it's going through my brain, you sure this wasn't sank on purpose? Are we very, very, very sure the Titanic wasn't sank on purpose? Just look at everything, all of the information we're receiving. Put it together.
the musicians of the Titanic. In this photo are the 8 musicians aboard the RMS Titanic. If you've read about the tragedy of the Titanic, it's likely that you've come across their names before. The orchestra, comprising 8 members under the leadership of bandmaster Wallace Henry Hartley, is celebrated for their exceptional courage and dedication to their art as the Titanic succumbed to its fate on April 15, 1912. Bandmaster Wallace Hartley, an English violinist, was esteemed for his musical talent and leadership. Following the disaster, his body was found and laid to rest in his hometown, Colne, Lancashire, where thousands attended his funeral. His violin was also recovered from the wreck, making it among the most valuable finds from what remained of the ship. John Law Hume was a Scottish violinist with a reputation for skillful musicianship. The band also included Georges Alexandre Crins, a Paris-born violinist. Aboard was also Percy Cornelius Taylor, proficient in piano and cello, and finally, John Wesley Woodward, a cellist. The story goes that these individuals continued to play soothing music for the passengers as the ship went down. While there are differing reports regarding their final performance and the last song they played, it's generally agreed that their music offered solace in the ship's harrowing last moments. Some survivors recalled the hymn Autumn, while others believed the last song was Nearer My God to Thee. In their final moments, they embraced their passion until they took their final breaths. Number 11.
I think we all remember that scene from the movie where the other dude walks, he's acting like he's gone, but then he walks back over there to join his bandmates, and they just start playing that sad. I don't even know what the song was, but it was just so sad. And their faces, like I could still see, like their faces will be forever, and I'm talking about the movie, will be forever ingrained in my head of what they looked like as that ship was going down.
Misleading Title. Whenever someone mentions the RMS Titanic, they often refer to her as the Unsinkable ship, but we never really found out how she got this moniker, which seemed to have emphasized its failure after its sinking. Contrary to popular belief, the Titanic was never officially described as unsinkable without qualification until after its sinking. Prior to the disaster, only 3 trade publications described the Titanic as practically unsinkable, and likely one of these was never published. And yet, it's pretty ironic that the Titanic continues to receive ridicule for the irony of its moniker and its final fate. Number 10. The Unsinkable Stewardess. Now perhaps you're wondering who this woman is. She's Violet Jessup, born in Argentina in 1887 to Irish immigrants. Her journey in the maritime world began as a nurse on the RMS Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship. She's become a popular name in the Titanic story because of her bizarre fate whenever she worked on a watercraft. Jessup's first encounter with maritime misfortune occurred in 1911 aboard the Olympic, which collided with the HMS Hawk. The Olympic faced a significant tear below the waterline, but managed to limp back to England. Despite the collision, Jessup maintained her composure. You would think Jessup would stop working on ships after one life-or-death situation, but somehow, Jessup still had the courage to board and work on the RMS Titanic. On that fateful night, Jessup, having just finished her prayers, was in bed when she heard a disturbing sound, initially thinking it was a drill. The concept of the supposedly unsinkable Titanic being in peril seemed implausible. Yet, less than 3 hours later, Jessup found herself in a lifeboat, witnessing the majestic ship vanish beneath the dark, icy North Atlantic. But just as she did on the RMS Olympic, she persevered and survived. Number 9. Titanic's Twin. This is a photo of the RMS Titanic, or at least what we believe is the RMS Titanic. There's a creepy conspiracy that the Titanic was swapped with its sister ship, the Britannic, as part of an elaborate insurance scam or a devious plan to avoid a financial disaster. Quite the audacious claim, isn't it? The RMS Britannic was the 3rd and largest vessel of the White Star Line, the same company that owned the Titanic. Constructed to be bigger and supposedly safer, the Britannic set sail after the Titanic's infamous iceberg incident. However, skeptics argue that the two ships were eerily similar, making a switch nearly seamless. They claimed that the Britannic, disguised as the Titanic, was intentionally sunk, allowing the owners to cash in on the insurance while keeping the supposedly unsinkable Titanic safe and sound. However, this theory doesn't really stand on its own. The Britannic did meet a tragic end, but not at the hands of an iceberg. In 1916, during World War I, The Britannic hit a mine and sank in the Aegean Sea. So the switch theory, however intriguing, loses some steam when faced with historical facts. Yet, the conspiracy enthusiasts persist. They argue that the sinking of the Britannic was an elaborate cover-up to conceal the original Titanic survival. However, no concrete evidence has ever surfaced to validate this claim. Even so, its dark nature makes it a persistent claim among conspiracy theorists. Number 8. Father Francis Brown. In 1912, Francis Brown received a first-class ticket for the Titanic's initial voyage from Southampton to Queenstown, now Cove, Ireland, as a gift from his uncle, the Bishop of Cloyne. As an avid amateur photographer, Brown captured many priceless photos on board the Titanic. His photos captured various facets of life on the ship, including its luxurious interiors, passengers, and crew. Among these were the only known photographs of Captain Edward John Smith inspecting lifeboats. These images, captured with his Kodak camera, represent the last known photos of many aboard the ship, including the vessel itself. But his story is different from the rest of the passengers. On board the Titanic, he made acquaintances with an American couple who offered to fund his trip to New York. However, after consulting with his Jesuit superior, Brown was instructed to get off the ship in Queenstown. He captured a lot of memories on board, and he ultimately survived the tragedy. Number 7. The sole Japanese survivor. Meet Masabumi Hosono, the sole Japanese survivor on that fateful night in 1912. Hosono was born in Japan in 1870 and worked as a journalist before pursuing further studies in the United States. It was during his return journey to Japan that he found himself aboard the Titanic, and yet he survived, but perhaps later in his life, he thought that death might have been better. You see, Hosono's survival was met with scrutiny back in Japan. The cultural expectations of the time, which placed great importance on self-sacrifice, made him a subject of public disapproval. Many women died, children as well, and his countrymen believed he was shameful for putting himself first. Hosono returned to Japan to face the judgment.
I wouldn't have went back home then. I'd have found me somewhere else to live then. If y'all felt like I shouldn't have survived, like, I get what you're trying to say. Almost kind of like saying the captain goes down with the ship regardless of what happens, but bro, I survived. At least welcome me, embrace me, to come home. Like, nah, I'd have had to go somewhere else to live. I ain't playing that.
Of a society that viewed survival at the expense of others as dishonorable. Understandably, there wasn't much known about Hosono after the incident. Number 6. The Goodwin Family. This photo has an incredibly tragic backstory. This was the Goodwins, a working-class family. They boarded the Titanic hoping to start anew and have a brighter future in the new world. Frederick, a 42-year-old signalman, and his wife, Augusta, 43, were accompanied by their 6 children: Lillian, Charles, William, Jesse, Harold, and baby Sydney. When the ship struck the iceberg, the Goodwin family found themselves in the midst of the unfolding tragedy. Augusta, desperately trying to keep her family together, struggled to find a lifeboat to accommodate them all. However, the rigid class distinctions of the time worked against them, and the Goodwins were separated. Augusta and the children ended up on Lifeboat 10, while Frederick was left behind on the sinking ship. The heart-wrenching decision tore the family apart, quite literally, as they faced the harsh reality that they might never see each other again. In the end, what remained of the Goodwin family struggled to make ends meet and perished in poverty. Number 5. Titanic Shipyard Number.
I always thought about that, you know what I mean? Being in that position and situation to have to be like, you know, I can't get on this lifeboat with my family. My family go ahead. You know? It's a no-brainer for me. I do it every single time. It's still, in that moment, though, you can understand what that is, that tear apart, whew. At that point in time, I'm diving in the water. Like, let me get this over with, man. Quickly.
390904. These were the numbers etched on the Titanic's hull. It looks innocent enough, just combined digits to identify the RMS Titanic. However, the story goes that it spells out something quite audacious. Conspiracy theorists suggest that the number was intentionally chosen to hold a deeper symbolic meaning. If you hold a mirror next to the ship's hull, it will spell out "No Pope." Sounds far-fetched, don't you think? Reportedly, The predominantly Catholic workforce at Harland and Wolff's Belfast shipyard believed there was a blasphemous message in the whole number, possibly assigned by Protestant individuals. This unsettling notion led them to halt work until the issue was addressed. The actual facts about the Titanic, including its design, construction, and the details of its ill-fated maiden voyage, are well documented and continue to be the subject of extensive research and interest. In my opinion, this is the creepiest and most horrific theory surrounding the tragedy of the Titanic, only if it's found to be true, that is. However, so far, there's really no solid evidence regarding this theory. Number 4. The ship's third class. With the number of films created after the RMS Titanic story, it's common knowledge that the ship was the epitome of luxury, at least in its first-class sections. The first-class passengers aboard the Titanic were the creme de la creme of society, ensconced in an environment of opulence. They were surrounded by the finest amenities, luxurious cabins, gourmet dining, and extravagant social spaces, all adorned with grandeur befitting the elite. With cabins strategically located closer to the lifeboats, they had a survival rate of about 62%, as highlighted in Sandra L. Taki's 1999 analysis. In stark contrast, the third-class passengers, consisting mainly of immigrants dreaming of a new life in America, experienced a very different journey. The third-class accommodations, though more comfortable compared to other ships of the time, were modest and functional. The cabins, located in the less desirable parts of the ship, were often irregularly shaped and subjected to the noise and vibrations of the engines. Public areas for these passengers were simple, emphasizing hygiene and maintenance over luxury. The segregation was not just in terms of amenities, but also in access to critical life-saving resources. The physical barriers and gates that separated third-class quarters from the rest of the ship made it challenging for these passengers to access lifeboats in time. When the tragedy struck, it wasn't just a disaster at sea. It was also a stark revelation of the social inequalities of the time. The disproportionate survival rates and the challenges faced by third-class passengers in accessing lifeboats and information showed the grim reality where one's social status could be a matter of life and death. Number 3.
That's why we all recall that scene of the lady putting her, as the ship's going down, the lady putting her kids, laying her kids down, tucking them in the bed, and just waiting for the inevitable to happen. Like, that's another scene that is ingrained in my brain.
Titanic Sea Trials. Sea trials are crucial for a ship's journey. Initially scheduled for April 1, 1912, the RMS Titanic's trials were postponed to the following day due to adverse weather. This tight schedule meant the Titanic had 1 day less in Southampton to be adequately supplied for its maiden voyage. On April 2nd, a clear day, the Titanic, with its skeleton crew of stokers, greasers, firemen, and various officials, embarked on its sea trials. Interestingly, despite the significance of this event, domestic staff were absent. Key figures like Thomas Andrews from Harland and Wolff and representatives from the Board of Trade, including Mr. Carruthers, were on board. Their presence was essential for the certification of the Titanic's seaworthiness. The trials themselves, lasting about 12 hours, were conducted with a limited crew and without the presence of the ship's domestic staff. This condensed timeline and reduced crew composition meant that the Titanic was tested under atypical conditions, not fully representative of its imminent operational environment. Despite these trials, the ship's maneuverability, speed, and stopping capabilities were assessed, but the tests were arguably not extensive enough for a vessel of Titanic's size and complexity. For instance, the most notable test, the crash stop, where the ship was brought to a halt from full speed, took the Titanic about 850 yards to stop completely. While the ship's top speed was recorded at 20 knots, it's possible that the full extent of the Titanic's capabilities remained unexplored due to the brief and somewhat superficial nature of these trials. Upon completion of the trials, the Titanic promptly departed from Southampton, leaving behind a significant opportunity for more comprehensive testing. This rushed approach, in hindsight, seems to have been a precursor to the broader set of oversights and miscalculations that tragically accumulated in the ship's demise. Number 2. Coal fire. The story of the Titanic's demise often centers around the iceberg collision, but another element might have played a significant role: a coal fire in one of its bunkers. This is why the RMS Titanic seemed to have given a lot of chances for the higher-ups to postpone her maiden voyage. Red flags, if you will. Before the Titanic embarked on its fateful voyage, a fire was smoldering in coal bunker number 6. This was a situation that the crew was aware of, even as the ship left Belfast for Southampton. Journalists
sign after sign after sign after sign that this ship had no business being out on the water.
Senan Milani, who has extensively studied the Titanic disaster, suggests that this fire may have weakened sections of the hull, making the ship more valuable to the damage caused by the iceberg collision. According to Milani's research, the intense heat from the fire could have made the steel hull brittle, reducing its strength significantly. This theory is bolstered by newly discovered photos showing dark marks on the hull near where the iceberg later struck the ship. The fire reportedly started about 10 days before the Titanic left Europe and continued to burn throughout the voyage. This long-duration fire in the coal bunker is believed to have compromised the structural integrity of the ship. Interestingly, officials at the time of the disaster knew about the fire, but seemingly downplayed its influence in the original inquiry into the Titanic's sinking. However, some experts argue that the location of the fire and the damage seen in photographs do not align, suggesting that the fire did not significantly contribute to the sinking. They point out that coal bunker fires were not unusual in ships of that era, and that the fire was contained and extinguished before the collision with the iceberg. And now, it's time for today's topic. An old camera found in the deep ocean revealed Titanic photos. Father Brown wasn't the only person who adored capturing photos. The story goes that a wealthy first-class passenger captured this gut-wrenching photo. What would you do if you were stuck on a sinking ship? Would you save your belongings? Or would you focus on saving your life? Well, if you asked me, it would be the latter. It's unknown who this woman was, whether she survived or what became of her or the item she was carrying. Despite her being unidentified, this photo perfectly captures the horrors she must have felt as the RMS Titanic slowly sank in the icy.
Look at her face. You could see the pain of, I would think, how cold that water is. You know what I mean? Imagine that water. Like they say you can go to some museum and stick your hand, I want to say it's in Tennessee or something, stick your hand or your finger in the water to feel the temperature of the water. Like this, that's what I'm seeing in her face and this guy's face off to the left.
Waters. Number 1.
Water cold.
Crowd boarding the Titanic. The boarding of the Titanic was a moment filled with contrasting emotions, excitement for the new journey, and poignant farewells to loved ones. For many, it was their last goodbye, a chilling thought when we reflect on the tragedy that followed. The first-class passengers, comprising the wealthy and elite, boarded the Titanic in elegant attire. Women wore laced corsets, expensive gowns, and satin shoes, while men donned tuxedos or suits and top hats. Prominent figures, including American millionaires like Benjamin Guggenheim and John Jacob Astor, and socialites like Molly Brown, were among the first-class passengers. They enjoyed luxurious accommodations and services, including sumptuous meals and extravagant staterooms. Third-class passengers, in contrast, were often workers or immigrants seeking a new life in America. Their attire was simpler, with women in long skirts and high-collared blouses, and men in breeches and iron shirts. The accommodations for third-class passengers were more Spartan, reflecting their socioeconomic status. Despite the stark differences in living conditions, these passengers shared a common hope and excitement for the future. Among them were about 120 Irish passengers, most of whom were immigrants, and a large number of passengers from other nations, including Scandinavians. It's heart-wrenching to think that for many of these passengers, the farewell they waved while boarding was their final goodbye. As the Titanic embarked on its ill-fated voyage, little did the passengers know that their dreams and aspirations would soon be engulfed by one of the most tragic maritime disasters in history. So which of these mysteries do you find the creepiest?
It's crazy. Titanic, after all these years, still gives me chills. Still, the story of the Titanic still gives me chills.